Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. We just finished our episode on the true conspiracy of Christianity, of the resurrection, which was an episode that we used to kick off this section of the season focused on religion. Now, I think this section of the season is really important because, I spent a lot of the season weaving in this idea of the false prophet of the church, of Christianity, this kind of bizarro version of Christianity that kind of has replaced throughout the ages the true Jesus-following way of Christianity. And so in the last episode, my point was to ground Christianity in the resurrection and to show that I do hold to the resurrection as a core belief and that I really do value Christianity and think it's important, which is why I spent a large part of this season critiquing what I think is a dangerous and false form of Christianity. In this section on religion, then, because I've spoken so much about the church in other sections, and we're going to get into some positive aspects in regard to discipleship later in the season, this section of the season is largely about exploring Christendom or Christianism specifically, and taking a look at what the problems are with the iterations of Christianity that we discussed. In this episode, we're kind of kicking that off with an interview that was one of my favorites so far. It was just a real joy to talk with Dr. Kalantzis in this episode, and I hope you'll enjoy it too. But just as a fair warning, this is going to be a very long introduction, and so I will put timestamps in the show notes so that you are able to skip all of my talking if you so desire and just get to the interview. But there is a lot that I want to set up before we get into the episode proper. One of the reasons I enjoyed my interview with Dr. Kalantzis here was because I thoroughly enjoyed his book, Caesar and the Lamb, which I highly recommend you grab. We'll also be talking with somebody else in the next episode or two about something somewhat similar. But what Dr. Kalantzis does in his book, Caesar and the Lamb, is he uses a lot of the early church to discuss some of the politics and nonviolence and stuff. And so he's got a zoomed-in focus there back in antiquity, back in the ante-Nicene church, which I find really invaluable. In fact, it was the early church is the thing that tipped the scales for me in regard to how I interpreted the words of Jesus, because they univocally, pretty much, and just in large numbers, they were identifying, Jesus's nonviolent ways and that sort of thing. But one of the things that I particularly liked about this book is that there's an emphasis on something that is known as sacralism, even though he doesn't use the word sacralism all that much. It's definitely present in there, and we'll kind of pull that out in this episode. But sacralism is a concept that I think is so important, and something that we just don't see, and a word that we hardly ever use, and that's something that's ever present in Caesar and the Lamb. And I think it's important because we are largely blind to sacralism today because of just kind of the way that we view religion, and we've partitioned it from the secular, and we think that because we're a secular society, we're not religious and we don't have religious practices. But we're so religious, and I think this interview helps to point that out. Another author who I think points this out really well, and I'm actually going to read a really long excerpt from him here in just a second, is James K.A. Smith in his book Desiring the Kingdom. In his book, it was one of the first times that I felt like there was a really good example given where I was like, holy cow, we are idolaters. We are worshipers. We do have a sacral society. So let me go ahead and read this excerpt, and I'll also put a link in the show notes where you can get this if you don't go out and read the full book, Desiring the Kingdom. Quote, I would like to invite you for a tour of one of the most important religious sites in our metropolitan area. It is the kind of place that may be quite familiar to many of you, but my task here is to invite you to see it with new eyes. As we're still off at a distance, I want you to notice the sheer popularity of the site, as indicated by the colorful sea of parking that surrounds the building. The site is throbbing with pilgrims every day of the week as thousands and thousands make the pilgrimage. In order to provide a hospitable environment and absorb the daily influx of faithful, the site provides an ocean of parking. But the monotony of black tarmac is covered by dots of color from cars and SUVs lined up, row by row, patiently waiting as the pilgrims devote themselves to the rituals inside. Indeed, the parking lot constitutes a kind of moat around the building, since there are no sidewalks that lead to the site. We begin to wend our way towards the building that sprawls in both directions and seems to be rising from the horizon, a dazzling array of glass and concrete with recognizable ornamentation. The architecture of the building has a recognizable code that makes us feel at home in any city. The large glass atriums at the entrance are framed by banners and flags. Familiar texts and symbols on the exterior walls help foreign faithful to quickly and easily identify what's inside, and the sprawling layout of the building is anchored by larger pavilions of sanctuaries akin to the vestibules of medieval cathedrals. We come to one of the several grandiose entrees in the building, channeling us through a colonnade of chromed arches to the towering glass face, with doors lining its base. As we enter the space, we are ushered into a narthex of sorts, intended for receiving, orienting, and channeling new seekers. There's a large map, a kind of worship aid, to give the novice an orientation to the location of various spiritual offerings and provide direction into the labyrinth that organizes and channels the ritual observance of the pilgrims. The design of the interior is inviting to an almost excessive degree, sucking us into the enclosed interior spaces, with windows on the ceiling open to the sky, but none on the walls open to the surrounding automotive moat. This conveys a sense of vertical and transcendent openness that at the same time shuts off the clamor and distraction of the horizontal, mundane world. This architectural mode of enclosure and enfolding offers a feeling of sanctuary, retreat, and escape. The worship space is very much governed by a kind of liturgical, festival calendar, variously draped in the colors, symbols, and images of an unending litany of holidays and festivals, to which new ones are regularly added, since the establishment of each new festival translates into greater numbers of pilgrims joining the processions into the sanctuary and engaging in worship. The layout of this temple has architectural echoes that hark back to the medieval cathedrals, mammoth religious spaces that can absorb all kinds of different religious activities all at one time. And so one might say that this religious building has a winding labyrinth for contemplations, alongside of which are innumerable chapels devoted to various saints. As we wander, we'll be struck by the rich iconography that lines the walls and interior spaces. Here is an array of three-dimensional icons adorned in garb that inspires us to be imitators of these exemplars. These statues and icons embody for us concrete images of the good life. Here is a religious proclamation that does not traffic in abstracted ideals or rules or doctrines, but rather offers to the imagination pictures and statues and moving images, offering embodied pictures of the redeemed that invite us imagine ourselves in their shoes. These same icons of the good life are found in such temples across the country and around the world. The symbols and colors and images associated with their religious life are readily recognized the world over. The wide circulation of these icons through various mediums, even outside the sanctuary, invites us to make the pilgrimage in the first place. This temple, like countless others now emerging around the world, offers a rich, embodied visual mode of evangelism that attracts us. This is a gospel whose power is beauty, which speaks to our deepest desires and compels us to come not with dire moralisms, but rather with a winsome invitation to share in this envisioned good life. As we pause to reflect on some of the icons on the outside of one of the chapels, we are thereby invited to consider what's happening within the chapel, invited to enter into the act of worship more properly, invited to taste and see. We are greeted by a welcoming acolyte who offers to shepherd us through the experience, but also has the wisdom to allow us to explore on our own terms. Sometimes we will enter cautiously, curiously, tentatively, making our way through this labyrinth within the labyrinth, having a vague sense of need but unsure of how it will be fulfilled. Having our sense of need, we come looking, not sure for what, but expectant, knowing that what we need must be here. After time spent focused and searching in what the faithful call the racks, with our newfound holy object in hand, we proceed to the altar, which is the consummation of worship. Behind the altar is the priest who presides over the consummating transaction. This is a religion of transaction, of exchange and communion. And so we make our sacrifice, leave our donation, but in return receive something with solidity that is wrapped in the colors and symbols of the saints in the season. Released by the priest with a benediction, we make our way out of the chapel in a kind of denouement, not necessarily to leave the temple, but rather to continue contemplation and be invited into another chapel. For who could resist the tangible realities of the good life so abundantly and invitingly offered? End quote. If you didn't catch that, of course, James K. A. Smith is talking about the mall, right? Now, some of those things are probably a bit of a stretch, right? Yet at the same time, you definitely you can feel some of the religiosity that goes into it. That there's a pattern to that sort of living, the construction, the architecture, and just the process. So sacralism is going to rear its head in a lot of ways. This is kind of a little bit of a trite, simple example. Nevertheless, I think it's something that helps you to realize that things that just seems really mundane often do have more infused meaning and messaging than you probably think. Besides the issue of sacralism, we also get to discuss the importance of origin stories in this interview. We glimpsed origin stories back in the False Prophet of Government episode, where we looked at the donation of Constantine. But origin stories are something that we think we are immune to today. In this episode, we discuss some of the American origin stories and how we curate our origins by expelling the bad parts of the history that we don't like, because that's not really who we are, while clinging to the good things and even fabricating or embellishing some of those good things. We want a collective identity of good without a collective responsibility. We want control over our future while exonerating us from our past. I mention here when we have this origin story episode that Hannah Arendt, in her work on revolution, she talked a bit about this kind of origin story, and I couldn't find the quotes in the mid interview, but I found it and want to include that here so you can reference this at that point. But she makes the connection between ancient myths of origin and the way that those bound people, beside the American binding in our origin stories. So here's what Arendt says, quote, "The word religion must be understood in its original Roman sense, and the piety of the founders would then consist in binding themselves back to a beginning, as Roman pietas consisted in being bound back to the beginning of Roman history, the foundation of the eternal city. And since it was in this respect that the American Revolution was most conspicuously different from all other revolutions which were to follow, one was tempted to conclude that it was the authority that the act of foundation carried in itself, rather than the belief in an eternal legislator, or the promises of reward and the threats of punishment in a future state, or even the doubtful self-evidence of the truths enumerated in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence that assured stability for the new republic." End quote. Now, I did splice just a little bit there in the middle, so if you want to see the full quote, you can check out Arendt's book on revolution and find the whole thing. But I mean, she's basically saying that all of these things that we look back to and talk about self-evidence and all of these other things, she just kind of compares the United States to other societies and to what was different And she talks about how it's this origin story that seems to be the glue that was able to help the United States to kind of move forward, because it was very Roman-esque. So it's a really fascinating argument. Arendt is extremely perceptive, and I like her because you can never really pin her down too much. She seems to kind of be somebody who's willing to say what she thinks is true, regardless of the implications for her. I mean, she got bashed by her own Jewish community as well for kind of saying things that she thought were true but were unpopular. And so she's somebody that I would at least give ear to, even if I don't end up agreeing with her. And so go check out her work if you want to dig more into origin stories. So sacralism, origin stories, those are all good things. But one of the other things that we talked a bit about, which is probably the most contentious thing, I would imagine, because even if you talk to pacifists and Christian anarchists, you still get people who have a hard time throwing off the idea of voting. But in this episode, we get to talk a bit about how voting is sort of a sacral act, and how it's, in some ways akin to kissing the bust of Caesar, right? It's this act that you're expected to do if you are a loyal, dedicated citizen of the empire, right? And people even say, they're like, it doesn't matter who you vote for, you just need to vote. They're appalled. People don't like it if you don't vote for the person that they think is the morally correct person, of course. But if you don't vote at all, that's like, that's like heretical, right? So we talk about how voting is a sacrament in our society, how it's an act of control, right? An act of preservation of group identity. It's a dissipator of guilt, and it's also an act that creates this moral indebtedness. It reminds me a little bit of the Bloods and the Crips, right? These gangs, they'll have somebody go out and kill somebody as an initiation, and that binds you to the gang, right? If you go out and vote, it's kind of the same thing. Well, I voted for the guy. I got to kind of stick with him because he's my guy. He's the one I voted for. And if I would admit that he's wrong, then I might bear some culpability, some guilt, right? Well, Aidan Balu, who I reference in here, he takes this a step further, and he says it doesn't matter if you didn't vote for the guy. If you voted at all, you are culpable because you agree to the system. And again, another quote that I wasn't able to pull up and reference and read in the interview, but I'm able to do that here. And I want to include Balu's argument against voting at all. And so here's what he says, quote, "As constituent supporters of human government, whether civil or military or a compound of both, in its state or national sovereignty, men are morally responsible for all constitutions, institutions, laws, processes, and usages which they have pledged themselves to support, or which they avowedly approve, or which they depend upon as instrumentalities for securing and promoting their personal welfare, or in which they acquiesce without positive remonstrance and disfellowship. Thus, if a political compact, a civil or military league, covenant, or constitution requires, authorizes, provides for, or tolerates war, bloodshed, capital punishment, slavery, or any kind of absolute injury, offensive or defensive, the man who swears, affirms, or otherwise pledges himself to support such a compact, league, covenant, or constitution is just as responsible for every act of injury done in strict conformity thereto, as if he himself personally committed it. He is not responsible for abuses and violations of the Constitution. But for all that is constitutionally done, he is responsible. The army is his army, the navy his navy, the militia his militia, the gallows his gallows, the pillory his pillory, the whipping post his whipping post, the branding iron his branding iron, the prison his prison, the dungeon his dungeon, and the slaveholding his slaveholding. When the constitutional majority declares war, it is his war. All the slaughter, rapine, ravages, robbery, destruction, and mischief committed under that declaration, in accordance with the laws of war, are his. Nor can he exculpate himself by pleading that he was one of a strenuous anti-war minority in the government. He was in the government. He had sworn, affirmed, or otherwise pledged himself that the majority should have discretionary power to declare war. He tied up his hands with that anti-Christian obligation to stand by the majority in all the crimes and abominations inseparable from war. It is therefore his war. Its murders are his murders. Its horrible injuries on humanity are his injuries. They are all committed with his solemn sanction. There is no escape from this terrible moral responsibility but by a conscientious withdrawal from such government, and an uncompromising protest against so much of its fundamental creed and constitutional law as is decidedly anti-Christian. He must cease to be its pledged supporter and approving dependent." End quote. So in brief summary, what Ballou is essentially saying is, look, when you go to vote, it doesn't matter who you vote for, right? What you are saying is when you agree to the voting system, you go and you cast your vote and you say, hey, you know what? I'm voting for this guy. And everything he does that is constitutionally legal, I'm agreeing to because I'm agreeing to this system. That means I agree to do whatever's constitutionally legitimate. And if my guy doesn't win, well, by my having voted and participated in the system, I'm saying that I'll agree to the outcomes of the system, provided they're legal, right? If there's something that is unconstitutional that happens or illegal, right, you're not agreeing to that because that's people going outside of the boundaries of what's agreed upon, and so they're messing with the system. But so far as the system functions legally and constitutionally, then you agree to everything that happens. Meaning, if the other guy wins, you've consented. You've consented to be a part of that system. And so all the horrors that are done are your responsibility because you consent to the system. I think it's a fascinating argument. I can understand intuitively when I first read it, I was kind of iffy about whether you could say that or not. But since then, I've thought of a number of analogies in non-voting, non-governmental situations, and I think it holds. I mean, when you agree to participate in a system, I agree. I think the logic of Ballou kind of is it makes sense. But anyway, something to chew on there. Of course, this also gets into a lot of consequentialism, which is a topic that is so important. I spent our whole second season addressing it, and it's something that you should go back and brush up on. But this idea of lesser of two evils or ends justifying the means, that just absolutely is not a Jesus ethic. Unfortunately, it currently is a big evangelical Christian ethic. It's one that they employ all the time. But it is absolutely, hands down, not at all a Christian ethic. And it's something that you should be aware of because it's a huge ethic that's employed by a lot of Christians, but it's absolutely immoral. And that's because the good is defined by faithfulness to Jesus, and unfortunately, that's been replaced in part through sacralism with this idea of the good of the state, right? We need to do what ends up giving us the best results. So I can vote for a guy who's not good if it gets me a Supreme Court justice, right? I can embrace some injustice in order to provide a bigger justice. So in an attempt to preserve two loyalties, God and mammon, God and state, whatever those are, we make the state and its power into a supposedly Christian entity, or we at least try to. And it's a Christian goal. And when it's a Christian goal, we can then sacrifice our fidelity on its altar and define that as good. Dr. Kalantzis says, quote, "Nowhere in Scripture are we called to change society. We're called to let the Holy Spirit change us." End quote. And I think that's something important to remember when we talk about this consequentialism, when we think that it's our job to change society. Of course, we'd love to see society transformed. The gospel is all about transformation, but that happens voluntarily on the individual level, and then it works up into societies. It's not something that we are meant to take a top-down approach on. And that's generally what consequentialism tries to do. It tries to do the most good, which ends up meaning that people try to grasp the most power to force the most good as they see it and define it. And in doing that, they end up doing tremendous amounts of evil and injustice. Finally, I was so excited that Dr. Kalantzis ended up talking about discipleship and how the church ought to function in the world. If you've listened to this season, that you know that I've been hinting at discipleship as the propaganda killers since the beginning, and I think Dr. Kalantzis explained how discipleship worked really, really well, and he was able to distinguish it from propaganda. Propaganda seeks to get us to become something that we are not. It tries to replace our identity, but discipleship, on the other hand, it reminds us who we truly are, and it tells us to seek action that's in line with reality, in line with our true selves. But what it ends up most churches have done is that we have turned discipleship into propaganda. We've actually conflated those things. And Dr. Kalantzis identifies this when he said that, quote, "We need to take discipleship back from a methodology to a way of life," end quote. What is discipleship as a methodology but an attempt to propagandize individuals? It treats them as objects to change rather than beings in which to uncover true identity. It objectifies people. There is really so much there, and hopefully I'll get to that in my episode later on discipleship in this season. And this also helps us with some previous conversations. When I did the interview with Greg Johnson and talked about his book, Still Time to Care, and why conversion therapy and that whole movement destroyed any reputation that evangelicals had in the gay community, it was because it objectified them, right? It didn't disciple them. And I think that's hard for people to see, because if you're a Christian who thinks that homosexuality is immoral, you'd say, well, conversion therapy was trying to get those people to be their true selves, who they ought to be in Christ. That's not objectification. And I get the sentiment there, but when Dr. Kalantzis was able to kind of unpack this a little bit, and if you read Greg Johnson's book, Still Time to Care, and you listen to our discussion, I think you can start to see how discipleship is so much different than trying to get some sort of conformity. Greg talked about how conversion therapy, you try to teach gay men how to throw a football and change the oil. Right? That's not discipleship. That's you're trying to conform them to a certain appearance, right? They weren't getting invited to Thanksgiving meals. They weren't part of a family. You're trying to fix these outward appearances. And that's propaganda. That's methodology. That's not discipleship. And so I think this is this interview here. We get into that a little bit, and it's just another piece of that puzzle in counter propaganda, which is discipleship. So this is also going to be an episode you might want to come back to, at least this section, because also it's going to connect with an episode that I'm going to put out in right about a month, which discusses a moral framework that I think might be helpful to understand in discussing our uncovering of true reality, the beings that we truly are. All right. That introduction is a whole episode in and of itself, but hopefully you found it informative and helpful. So without further ado, here is the interview with Dr. George Kalantzis. So I recently read your book, Caesar and the Lamb, and I also recently heard you give an interview which touched on a topic that I've been wrestling with for quite a while now, and that's the topic of sacralism, which I don't think all that many people are probably too familiar with. But I thought that this would be a really good interview to have because I'm just finishing up a season on propaganda and truth.
Mhm.
And sacralism, it strikes me as an extremely subtle form of propagandizing. And
Mhm.
as I've uncovered more and more of it, it seems like is particularly a form that we Christians seem susceptible to. So I want to dig into sacralism in this episode.
Okay.
But before we do, I would love for you to give an introduction of yourself and maybe briefly describe some of your works or your passions.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be with you. I was George Kalantzis. I teach theology at Wheaton College in Chicago, in the US. And I also direct the Wheaton Center for Early Christian Studies. My work has been in patristics, that is the study of early Christianity. I work primarily in the historical setting of the early church, both doctrinal and social. And that is where this aspect of my work on the relationship between the church and society around it came. Originally, I was born and raised in Greece, in the evangelical community in Greece, and have been in Chicago now for 37 winters. That's how we count the years here. So 37 winters.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, like I mentioned, I first came across the term sacralism just a couple years ago, and it was, I don't know if you're familiar with Leonard Verduin's work.
Not that much. Yes, just a little bit.
Okay. Well, he kind of convinced me that sacralism was really significant, and this was all happening like for me right around 2016 with the elections and just conservative Christianity in turmoil. But still, even 5 years out, 6 years out from that, sacralism just isn't a term that I see discussed. And I felt like your book talked about sacralism a lot, but I actually just tonight, I wanted to verify. I went back and I did a search through the Kindle version, and it really, you only bring up the exact term twice in your book, yet it felt like it was just steeped in it. So I think it's something that we're familiar with. We just don't know what to term it. So maybe you could define sacralism a bit and explain what it's all about, why it's important for us to see.
The whole idea of we have to think historically here, and we have, when we think about sacralism or the sacred in our time, we think of sacrament, sacred, religiosity, the gods, God, etc., very differently than the world before the Enlightenment or before the last 150, perhaps 200 years. Societies are held together by a variety of means, but fundamentally, for a society to be held together as that society and not another society, it has to have things that it has sacred. In other words, things that identify, things that form, things that educate, things that demand that members of the society behave in a particular way for a particular purpose towards a particular end. And when those behaviors, not just ideas, but also behaviors, are transgressed, then we have problems within that society. So in ancient societies, as well as now, that's what the sacralism would look like. The sacred behaviors that we hold for ourselves to be true, and without them, we're not the people who we are. So that also has consequence, right? Think of, in the American experience, think of what are the sacred ideas, principles, practices that we have that hold us together as one society. Think about Europe, and each European country or society has its own. Think about Christians as a group, if that can be held in a global sense as such. What are the things that, if we're not practiced this particular way, then we have issues within the community? So a sacral society, as you define it, is a society held together by the sacred. What is that sacred? It can be an ideology, it could be a religious idea, it can be a creed or set of creeds, but it's also fundamentally practices, expressing practices. Think of baptism for Christians, which is a fundamental behavior. For whom is it? To what end is it? How is it to be enacted? Or in Christianese, we would say, in whose name are you baptized? Right? What formula do you use to be baptized? Or think of the Lord's table or the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. Do we divide according to the words we use and the practices we have? And then one has to think of what offering or sacrifice, in the language of sacrifice that is used within our social endeavors. One has to think about, I just came from a tour of 5 countries with students for 6 weeks. And every country we went to, somewhere in their capital, has a tomb of the unnamed soldier. And the language in front of that would be of sacrifice. These are the people who have sacrificed. Well, what does that mean? That's religious language. That is not a civil language. A sacrifice is an offering to something and someone. Who is that someone? Is it a deity? Is it a set of deities? What is it? We think of soldiers who sacrifice themselves for the what? We say for the good of the country, for freedom, at the altar of what? This is our religious language in which we're very, very steeped, but don't understand.
Yeah, I think it seems like we think of idolatry and those sorts of things as being something of the barbaric past, where you have these graven images that are sitting in front of you, and we don't recognize some of these things. Like, when you're talking about the tomb of the unknown soldier, it also triggered in my mind. I think it's in the Capitol building. They have the apotheosis of Washington, this big mural. Right. I mean, that's a religious term right there. Or the Lincoln Monument, right? In this temple. And then it calls him a savior. Like, in this temple is our savior. So we've got this kind of stuff all over the place. Why don't we see it like we can see it when the Romans did it, but we can't see it when we do it?
Yeah, because, and I argue that both in writing and I want to test this out also with you, because we have fallen into a verbal habit and narratival habit. We use the expression in the Western world, especially in the US, of a separation of religion or church and state. And that's just simply a mental concept. It is just simply an idea, not practiced, but it informs the way we see the world. We see ourselves as desacralized, even though we're fully sacralized. So we tell ourselves a story that, no, we're not. We don't believe or function the way pre-Enlightenment people did, because we understand that there are no deities behind healings and springs and the wind and all that. We are what we call a secular people. But in reality, we're anything but that. I grew up in Greece, or think of football like as God intended it, like football, like proper football.
Yeah, where you actually use your feet. Yeah,
that's right. That one. And think about how often it is spoken in religious terms. So-and-so is our God, right? We're talking about play. And we say, yeah, we really don't mean it. Really? Then why do you clash with the other team physically, like battles, people in stretchers, right? Throwing rocks and behaving that way. Is that not a religious relationship? Is not a sacral or sacramental relationship? the same thing in the US we have with every aspect of life. We have a bad habit of singing the national anthem or raising the flag at the beginning of basketball games or American football games or whatever it may be. What does the national anthem have to do with a sport event itself? Well, it's a religious practice. It's not a civic practice. It's a religious practice. And rather, it is a civic religious practice. I do an exercise with my students quite often in class. Many of them come from public schools. Some of them come from private schools, et cetera, et cetera. But most of them come from American educational system. And we're in the middle of the class and say, when we talk about sacraments, and say, do you understand the concept of being formed into a people? Well, let's play a game. Can you recite the Pledge of Allegiance? They giggle for a moment and go ahead. Just go ahead. And they start, and within 3 seconds, they're in unison, right? The whole Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the, et cetera, et cetera. They stop at the same place, they put the comma in the same place, they take the breath in there, and they finish in unison. Good, great. Now recite the creed. And everything goes array because somebody's going to start this creed, somebody's going to start that creed, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, somebody knows it, most people don't know it, everybody perhaps knows like the first 4 words, and go. So what just happened? Do you realize that for 18 years of your life, every day you stood up and recited a creed that formed you into a particular kind of people, right? It formed you in a particular kind of people. People who can recite this pledge. But it's more than that. What did you do for 18 years every day of your school life? You pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. But let's stay in the first part. If you take Nepalese flag in class, right? Print it in paper, bring it to class, and rip it apart. Just rip the flag. Some would go, why are you doing this? You shouldn't be doing this. But, okay. Most people go, I don't really care. And then you take pick a Canadian flag, right? And you do the same. People go, they're Canadians, they don't care anyway. And then you take an American flag and you rip it. And then you have that right here. It's like a punch in the gut, right? Why? Because every day for 18 years, you pledge allegiance to that thing. Yeah. That's how it works.
Yeah, there's another section in your book where you talk about the main reasons that people in ancient times would sacrifice to the gods. You talk about honoring them, expressing gratitude, and obtaining some benefit. And so when you're talking about the pledge here and what's going on just internally, even if they don't realize how they're being shaped over 18 years, they've got these mantras of pledging allegiance, it's a republic, there's freedom, there are all of these things that are wrapped up in it. And so, there's this idea that you have to honor, express gratitude, and obtain some benefit, which reminds me so much of the Lord's prayer, our Father who art in heaven, give us our daily bread, all that stuff. But what's really fascinating to me is that I'm a Protestant, and as an evangelical Protestant, a Reformed Protestant, I've heard a lot of people speaking against Catholicism for most of my life, and the Orthodox Church now that I'm here in Romania, and they say they have icons in their church. That's idolatry. There's no distinction between veneration and worship. Veneration is worship. And then you get to the flag and you get to these other emblems of the United States, And all of a sudden, it seems like there is a distinction for a lot of evangelical conservative Protestants between veneration and worship. They just only make that distinction when it comes to the state. So I'd love for you to maybe expound a little bit on, is this just veneration? Are people just venerating these symbols, or is this worship? Like, how would you distinguish that?
I don't think it's actually only veneration. If it was such a distinction, veneration rather than worship, then one would not kill on behalf of that one venerates, not worships. That's different. One would not put oneself in the place of being killed for that, right? So what do we see here? We see what we call Christian nationalism. We see, in other words, worship misplaced. It may, in a theoretical level, in some abstract concept, be conceptually, do you see how many qualifiers there, treated as respect. We wouldn't use the word veneration because it seems very Catholic or Orthodox, rather than worship. Yet the action itself and the language we use is of worship. We sacrifice at the altar of freedom. That's worship language, right? As you said, the apotheosis that we have from our currency to our statuary, right? That's not veneration. That's worship. And how do you know that? I dare somebody to deface that. Then will you see what you actually worship.
Yeah, exactly.
And we see that everywhere. January 6th of a few years ago here in the United States was a prime example of that, right? And we forget that the veneration, John of Damascus in his homilies in defense of the icon, veneration is a different order of relationship than worship is. Why? Because I worship the one who actually is, as John says, the Damascene says. That is God, right? I venerate the one whose example or whose person or the story or I respect. But I don't kill for the one I respect.
Oh, that's a great distinction. Right? Yeah, I like that. It's talking about this. There are a lot of ways that I think we are too hard on people from ancient times, thinking that they're just these ignorant barbarians who did stupid things like bow down to graven images, when we're doing something similar there. But there's another way that I feel like I've seen sacralism kind of pop up a bit. And I think it was Hannah Arendt. She wrote a bunch of different political works, but in one of those works, she talked about how the United States was really centered around this mythology of origin, like a foundation. Mm-hmm. And it was really fascinating to me because as I was trying to figure out what topics I was going to do in regard to religion and the state and things, I came across two ancient documents, the Donation of Constantine and the Marvels of Rome. And both of those documents were used in different ways, but they were basically propaganda pieces. And the way that they functioned was they said, okay, here's, the Marvels of Rome was the most interesting one to me because it's basically saying, that you've got Noah building his wall around Rome, and so Rome and Noah are associated, the patriarchs, and you're like, that's just so ridiculous that you need an origin story of that magnitude to justify, who you are as a people. Yet it seems like the more I study about American history and the things that we don't want to come to light about our past, and the things that we do highlight, and the hills that we want to die on in order to protect certain ideas about our origins, I'm coming more to the realization that we're really not different than the ancients in regard to our origin stories. It's just we think our origin stories are more believable than Noah building a wall around our city. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what is the role of origins, and why are origins really a part of sacralism and important for the social bonding?
Well, Elizabeth Castelli has a great book called Martyrdom and Memory. And she deals with the very concept of how narrative, storytelling, forms people into the people they are. It's a wonderful book, and I highly suggest. And she has a section in the beginning of the book on myth, history, fact. Right. And as she goes through the story of myth, we use the word myth as fantasy, as Disney, as something that comes out of, imagination. But myth throughout the human history is storytelling that has a purpose. And Castelli says very clearly, speaking mythologically, it has a purpose, and that purpose is to unify the past so as to provide a unified present or a hopeful unified future. In other words, we tell stories that unite the past into the people we want to be today and in the future. That's how storytelling works. Romans had the same thing. Ancient Greeks had the same thing. Sumerians had the same thing. Everyone has the same thing. Why are who we are today? Because of here where we're coming from. Was this not great? We have a great story. Nobody begins, well, we were a bunch of idiots who knew nothing about nothing, and whoop, here we are today. Like, that's not how this works. It says, we were humble in our beginnings. Tribes were disunited, but there was this figure or these figures who, with the aid of the gods, united us and turned us towards the blessing of those gods, so as we can worship properly and well the gods or the god or whatever that is, who then bestowed upon us virtue, power, success, continuity, 1,000 years of success as the Romans had by the time of Jesus or the early church, right? And therefore, we are in a close connection with those gods or that god or that deity in a proper way. When we come to the time of the early church, or the early Jesus and the first post-apostolic period, Rome has been Rome for 1,000 years. It has been Rome for 800 to 1,000 years. By the time of this Augustan or the Julio-Claudian period, they're the greatest empire that has existed. Why? Well, because the gods showed their favor on us. Why? Because there were these two brothers who united us around the worship of those gods. And therefore, the favor of the gods came to us. That's how origin stories work, right? And the purpose, the idea is that we unite them as a people. So today, if you have out of a unified past, a unified present, we are not going to go against that narrative, because if we do, then we run the risk of incurring the wrath of the gods or the withholding of blessing from the gods.
Yeah, I think it was actually on page 1 of your book. said something to the extent that narratives are character formative.
That's right.
And that's just something that it seems hard for me as an individual American. I think it's very difficult for a lot of Westerners and especially Americans who think that we're individualists to feel like we're reliant on these symbols and on these narratives to define us, because I define myself.
Well, maybe. It's almost like, think about what is the quintessential American locus place? Well, the mall, right? Every teenager goes to the mall to be an individual, right? And everybody comes out looking the same. Why? Because the stores are owned by like 4 companies. All the stores, the myriads of stores are like 4 or 5 companies, right? That's the idea. So we have a narrative of individualism, which is the key ingredient of the Enlightenment, but we actually don't function like that. And if the last few years, call them 6, 10, whatever you want to bracket them, 20 years, have shown us here in the US is how storytelling forms us into groups of people who have separate identities. If one is consuming the Fox News ecosystem versus the MSNBC or CNN or whatever else ecosystem, these are not the same groups of understanding how history works and how current events actually function. We inhabit 2 different worlds in the same neighborhood because of storytelling. But even further back into the story of origins, right? We speak here in the US of the founding fathers as Christians or Judeo-Christians. I don't know when the Judeo came into the Christian thing, but Judeo-Christian value, right? Who are the founding fathers? Well, late 18th century landed aristocrats. So what about 1619? So what about 2 centuries before that? That's not the founding of our country? That's not part of our story? We suddenly just plopped into the 1770s? Is it a sui generis movement? And when we say they're Christians, or the country is founded on Christian values, what are you actually talking about? Forgiveness of debts, love of enemy, peacemaking, meekness? Are those not the Christian values on which Christian community is founded? What other Christian values are we talking about? But the narrative of this is a Christian nation has overtaken the reality of the story. And it has formed us into a people who see ourselves as therefore blessed by the God of the Christians because we have behaved in this particular way. Without asking, what is this particular way? Slavery? The Trail of Tears? The Civil War? I mean, what exactly is it that is Christian in this founding of this Christian nation?
Yeah, that reminds me of jumping all over the place here, but it's good.
That's okay.
Give me a second just to find it. Yeah, so sacralism is something that I think you highlight really well in your book that fits right here. You're talking about ignoring certain parts of our past and kind of highlighting the good things. But it does 2 essential things. I think you say, basically in summary, you say that it distracts us from the negative, and it also is able to dissipate guilt. So it can give us a sense of control and a sense of absolution. Yeah. So we have security and control when we're part of a unified group. We feel secure in that group. But we also have absolution in that guilt can be diffused among all of society rather than being borne by me, the individual. So, for example, when the U.S. came together around the flag after 9/11, I felt invigorated, and I was part of a group. And even though we were attacked, we were good, and we weren't going to be able to be kept down. So I had some peace from that. But conversely, after the unjust invasion of Iraq, I didn't feel guilty, even though I had voted for Bush. I didn't feel guilty over a problematic invasion of Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people, because I didn't order the invasion. So I was able to have my guilt kind of assuaged a bit through that.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit more kind of, I know you expounded on slavery and kind of our history and that kind of stuff, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about the function of sacralism and group identity in helping us to dissipate that guilt and give us a sense of control.
And the example that you used is a very good example. It's not the only example. Think about Manifest Destiny, right? The movement westward, the imperial colonization of, let's say, the Philippines and everything else in between, or the continuous expansion of the American empire throughout the 20th century, especially after World War II, right? Not my fault. I didn't participate in that. Yet I drive on roads that are created by the funds that come from that. Or the current debate of, I don't have slaves. My family didn't have slaves. Why am I guilty for slavery? Right? That's guilt is dissipated into that. Have we noticed in the Lord's Prayer that the petition to forgive our sins is in the plural? And forgive us our sins as we forgive those who trespass against us, who sin against us. See, the scriptures, one of the things that the trick that English plays on us is that we're not an inflected language. We don't have, for us, the singular and the plural, second person is the same. You, singular and plural. In the New Testament, in Greek, it's vastly different. It's plural and singular, two different words. The vast majority of the New Testament, with a very few personal exceptions, is plural. It's not singular. Therefore, the understanding of sin as communal, as social, and therefore the results of that as a social expression in which I participate in that group identity are ever present. In our linguistic idiom, that is also dissipated both by the idea that at some place I'm not responsible for the system, even though I voted for the system, or I participate in the system, or I benefit in the system, or whatever it is. And it's not my doing, it's somebody else's doing. So I rarely question, where do my tax dollars go? Who knit the shirt that I wear? Where did it come from? That's part of the social responsibility that somehow I'm trying to avoid. Because if I start asking those questions, then I cannot escape the responsibility. What do I do as a citizen of a country that has responsibility for the outward and the inward expression, foreign policy and domestic policy of the government I support? Am I responsible for it? Or my responsibility ends after I cast my vote? Is my place as a Christian to hold the state accountable, both as an individual and as a collective, the church, capital T, capital C? The government, many of our friends are quick to point, government is appointed by God, but government is appointed by God for a particular purpose, and that is to enact the justice of God, right? Not any justice anywhere, the justice of God. So what is the purpose of the church? The purpose of the church is to hold governments accountable to the justice for which they have been appointed. That's not their justice, that is the justice of God. So when in a narrative that tells me that I am somehow separated from the civic religion that is our life together, the sacredness of the space that we occupy together, even the very fact that some of us could argue that perhaps we have transformed secular and sacred as two different domains when they never were, then that absolves me of responsibility for which I should be fully accountable. In a second edition of this book, Caesar and the Lamb, that's coming out in a year's time or so, less than a year from now, I have an addendum. I play out with the idea of penance, the medieval concept of penance for those who come back from military campaigns, and I add to that civic administration. Throughout the history of the church, there was an understanding that war is traumatic. We're coming again back to this after Vietnam War, after Desert Storm, etc. Now we have language to use, PTSD and other. But in medieval times, they didn't have that, or in late antique times, they didn't have that vocabulary. But what they knew, as Basil of Caesarea, the bishop said, is that bloody hands cannot come to the Eucharist. So they had a period of time for penance where combatants would need to be, it was not punitive, it was pastoral care. Need to work through confession and pastoral care to cleanse themselves, to come back to the table. And I play with the idea, I want to propose for us, especially as evangelicals, especially as Protestants, a reimagining of that category and of that practice, in which those who come back from military campaigns, we don't throw parades for them as churches, but we rather welcome them into a period of penance. Not just them, but we invite ourselves as churches to enter that period of penance with them. Why? Because it's our action or inaction that made it requirement for them to go to war. Do you see how this works?
Yeah, no, I think that's beautiful, the action or inaction, because I think it's very easy, if you go one route and you vote and do all of this stuff, you can say, well, I did my job. But if you abstain, you can say, well, I didn't participate in contributing to this war, but really it's all of us as a collective responsibility.
There's no more clear example than the Kuwait, the Desert Storm. Now it's ancient history, but it's like 30 years ago, right? 500,000 troops gathered at the borders of Kuwait to what was the excuse? Restore freedom. And I remember Cornel West asked a question. So if the product of Kuwait was not oil, but chrysanthemums, would we have invaded?
Yeah, of course
not. No, I mean, the answer is clearly not, right? If they produce artichokes and chrysanthemums, we will not have invaded. We will not have sent 500,000 troops in. But why did we send them in? Because I want to drive a car that consumes, a lot of gas, but I want to pay cheaply for it. I want cheap gas for my big car, So I sent people to war.
And Iraqi lives were cheap.
That's right.
For us. Yeah.
And our lives. I mean, and American lives were cheap. American lives were cheap. Iraqi lives were cheap. Afghani lives were cheap. Right? Syrian lives are cheap. Migrant lives are less than cheap. Why? Because I want to have fruit, produce that is very cheap, inexpensive. So am I not culpable for that?
Yeah. So one of the things that that was touched on quite a bit there was in regard to we had mentioned voting a number of times. So I'd like to talk about voting as from kind of two angles. One angle is voting as a sacral act. In the book, you mention, you have a quote. You say, "The piety of the Roman was civic, communal, and public, which is why Roman society grew increasingly suspicious of religious practices that advocated the role of personal belief, private piety, and secret rituals." So you think about voting.
Yeah.
And to me, it seems like a very clearly sacral act. You go in, you get a sticker, you plop that sticker on, you put it on social media, and I participated, and I abstained from the last election, and from the election before, I voted for like a third-party candidate. And when I voted for the third-party candidate, that was, people didn't like that. They thought I was being immoral for throwing my vote away. But man, when I abstained, they just that is immoral to do that.
I hear that.
So I would love for you to talk a little bit about the sacral act of voting. If you agree with that, if you agree that it's sacral.
It is, primarily because it is one of those binding public acts that we do as society. I'll start by saying that I always vote. I always vote. I stand on the first Tuesday morning of November, 5:30 in the morning. I go to my to the high school down here, stand in line, get my ballot, and I always vote exactly the same way. None of the above. I don't do Jesus or Mickey Mouse or whoever, because that's just silly. In European societies and others, we have a long tradition of the protest vote, the blank vote, as an option, and those are always tabulated at the end and shown as a result. In the US, we don't have that. We have a forced choice between two options that, I'm going to use the word the system, in quotation marks, has already presented to us as the only two viable options. Rarely a third one, never to be considered seriously, simply as a spoiler. But that very act of choosing between the lesser of two evils is still choosing evil. Do you see? But I always participate by going in and rejecting that option. None of the above. Why? Because then I cannot be accused of, well, you were too lazy to go and vote, or you don't take this seriously. I take it very, very seriously. I take it more seriously than the peer pressure or the community pressure of voting for this for X, Y, and Z reasons, or that one for the other A, B, and C reasons, right? If I have to choose between two evils, I choose no evil. Now, okay, what did you gain by doing that? Well, in my little one vote way, nothing other than the right to be part in the discussions, political discussions, when we talk about our common life together. Because if you sit on my couch and go, better sleep another half hour, I haven't earned the right to speak. right? I have stood in line. I have rejected in public the options that have been given to me. But imagine if like 50 million evangelicals did this. If 50 million evangelicals, or however many we are, went into the voting booth and wrote none of the above. Not Jesus, not Mickey Mouse, not, none of the above. Wouldn't somebody notice that? And one may not affect that election cycle because those will be taken aside. But what about the next one? Have you noticed that we evangelicals are now a marketable bloc? How will the evangelicals vote, right? You go, wait a minute, what? This is a marketable group to whom we need to create this set of language and advertisement and appeals so that they may support our narrative and our candidate for our benefit. It's no different than Coke does and beer companies do. It's the same exact idea. You have the 18 to 24 demographic, you have the 30 to 50 demographic, you have the evangelicals. It's the same thing, right? But what would happen if evangelicals, Christians, those who claim, the Lordship of Christ, said, none of this is acceptable for a simple reason. None of them is enacting the justice of God.
Yeah, what you said there, that line of thinking is exactly what got me down this path when in the 2016 election, when it finally hit me that, man, I'm choosing between a lesser evil, and then it struck me that, well, that's not really a Christian ethic to do that, is it?
That's right.
So
That's
there has to be some moral option.
Yeah.
Like what is my moral option? And when I started going down that route, I recognized how steeped in consequentialist ethics we evangelicals are. Even though we talk about integrity and doing the right thing no matter what it costs you, that just isn't how it really plays out for our moral ethic, it seems.
No, because most of our yearning for 50, 70 years, and there are a lot of books that have been written recently on that, and one can find them and pursue them. The history of evangelicalism, or I worked after the Second World War, has singularly been about power. It hasn't been about justice. It has been about power. Political power, social power, economic power, academic power, whatever power, but it has been about power. So I'm going to vote for the one who's going to give me more power, right? I even heard that famous evangelical leader within the evangelical world say, we're tired of being the punching bag. And I was about to send him a Bible and ask him to highlight where that actually principle comes from. Like, no one has read Paul's description of his own life. No one has read the life. Like Jesus. I mean, the idea of that we are tired of being a punching bag is so anti-Christian as to be singularly pagan. It's idolatry. Because fundamentally, it dismisses the sovereignty of Christ.
I couldn't agree more. I want to try to wrap this up in the next 10 minutes. So I've got two more questions for you.
Okay.
And you can take as long as you want on them. But these are the last two. One of the things that kind of that struck me in here was you had a quote that says, Roman religion was not concerned with distinguishing true from false beliefs. It was simply the proper behavior that characterized the life of the Roman citizen. And when I try to think about how I would used to think about these sorts of things when I'm doing this conversation, and just I think 10 years ago, I would feel like, okay, yeah, maybe saying a Pledge of Allegiance every day in school is a little crazy. It's a little bit too much. But I think I would struggle with this idea that I really am idolatrous to a certain extent. And I think that's because it seems to me like evangelicalism a lot of times tends to be so much about orthodoxy and I mean, hence all the denominationalism, but it's so much about right belief and a lot less about right practice. But one of the things that stuck out to me when I first started studying propaganda, reading Jacques Ellul and his book on propaganda, he said, look, propagandists, they don't care what you believe. They care what you do. And so he gives the example. You can say all you want that you don't believe their propaganda, but if you go out and buy their product, they don't care what you believe. And so we have sort of these two sets, these things that we say we believe and these things that we show we believe, which is akin to, what James tells us.
Yeah.
I'd love for you in just a couple minutes, which I don't know if that's possible, but to talk a little bit about all this sacralism that we talked about. How does that fit in with our problem with orthopraxy and our elevation of orthodoxy? How does the sacralism get us to do things that we say we don't believe in?
Religio was religare, to bind together, for the Romans, for the Greeks and the Romans, right? To bind a community together. So it was based on practices. In the last 1800 years, it has transitioned from a social binding together to an interiorization. It's about what you believe up here. That's clearly can be seen happening in the 15th century and 16th centuries, right? So from a social orthopraxis, right? How do you know I'm a Christian? By the way I live my life. To how do you know I'm a Christian? By what I confess with my mouth, right? That movement then led to a privatization of religion. And if religion is private, then religion is relative. Your religion, my religion, doesn't matter as long as we, do this thing together. So the full circle comes around, which is the social thing together. I leave you in peace, you leave me in peace. We have a good fence in our yards and we're good, right? The movement to creedal confessions are signs of who we are, rather than lived out faith, is also part of a linguistic narrative. Because in English, we have, from Latin, English especially, we have two words that sound as different: belief and faith. In Greek, pistis is the root word for both. Faith, pistis, is fides, what the Latin would have fides, right? Every Roman general, at the elevation of the commission, would have a ring with the word fides on it. The emperor doesn't care what gods you worship. Are you faithful? Belief is faithfulness. Pistis is pistotis, right? Faith is faithfulness. How do I know your faith? By the way you walk your life. I play another game with my students to say, take your index finger and point to the part of your body where faith resides. And they go, okay, my head. Okay, others go, oh, my heart. Great, others go, I have no idea what you're talking about. But I always lead them to see that actually they should be pointing at the bottom of their feet. How you walk your life, right? Now, here's the difference. For the Romans and propagandists and the American, every civil system, I really don't care which God you worship, or any God, as long as you do the proper things when we all do them together, right? Pay your taxes, stand for the national anthem, do whatever it is that we do together to say we're one people, right? Go to the fireworks on 4th of July, like the things we do as one people. But for the Christian, it's the other way around. I do the things I do because I belong to the God whom I confess with my mouth. It's the difference between, I would say theologically, etiology and teleology. The Romans did things together to be one people. Christians do things, particular things, because they are this kind of people.
Oh, that's really fascinating because the conclusion that I've drawn and kind of the culmination of the season is I'm not just looking at propaganda, but I want to look at, okay, well, what does that mean for us positively? How do we act? And my conclusion has been that the answer to propaganda is discipleship. I think discipleship is the antithesis of propaganda.
Yeah.
But at the same time, sometimes it's hard to distinguish, because if you're saying, well, the antithesis of propaganda is to get yourself in an echo chamber in a community that is going to teach you the right things, that just sounds like alternative forms of propaganda. But the way that you just described that is in the direction of where you start from. That seems like it makes a very big difference in propaganda versus discipleship.
Absolutely. Why do Christians feed the hungry? Because that's what Christians do. That's etiology, right? That's causal. Why are Christians peacekeepers, peacemakers? Because that's what Christians do, right? Not so that we may have peace in society. That's teleology, right? So Christian peacemaking would be interested or begin in justice, in the protection of the oppressed, in standing against the oppressor, right? Hopefully, bringing oppressor and oppressed together in a amicable, peaceful resolution. If not, the Christian doesn't stand in the gap in the middle between oppressor and oppressed, worried and afraid about the violence inflicted upon oneself. Why do nations engage in peacemaking? So that they may have profit. Prosperity, profit, it's the same thing. Those are two different things, two completely different things. And that's what we forget. Propagandists, or in any sense, say civil religion, want you to behave in a particular way, regardless of who you are. Christians flipped that and said, because I am who I am, I behave this particular way.
And that last 5 minutes is gold for me. It's helping to make so many connections, and I appreciate that insight.
What's the other question that you had?
So yeah, last question for you. How do we fix this? where do we go from here? How do Christians unpropagandize themselves? How do I unpropagandize myself? And then step 2, how do I then in my community help us to see these things and change direction?
Yeah. The first principle, the first step in peacemaking is to see the problem, to see the conflict, recognize it as conflict. The first step in this discussion is to recognize the problem. And the problem is that we're more deeply affected by civic religious formation than by religious formation. The state, in all its instrument, the capital T, capital S state, right? Not the state of that. The state has a lot more influence on us than the church does, the gospel does. A last game I use in class is I ask students to close their eyes. And I give them about 10 minutes for the giggles to go. Well, and then I say, I want you to paint a picture. I'll give you 20 seconds. If you project yourself out 15 years, let's say, it's easy to do. They're 20 years old. They can do that. What does success look like? Paint a picture. And I give them about 20 seconds. They don't need more than that. For most of them, immediately they have an image in their head, right? They're university students. They go, I know what it looks like. And then I ask them, I don't ask them for that image that's their own. Who gave you that image? Who formed for you that is what success looks like? Your family, your community, movies, the mall. Somebody framed for you and says, this is what success looks like, right? That's discipleship. So how do we fix this? How do we address this? As churches, we take discipleship back from a methodology to a way of life. The Book of Common Prayer has a practice that my church engages in that I find extremely annoying and irritatingly difficult to do. And that is, and it has the words right there, it forces me to pray by name for those in authority. Whether I agree with them or not, it forces me by name to pray for President so-and-so and Governor so-and-so. That forces me to move outside of my likes and dislikes and to pray for the one who is in that seat of authority to enact the justice of God. That's discipline. And I'm not good at it. So every Sunday, I have to be forced by my church in writing to enter it. And slowly, the animus goes away. And slowly, the dislike goes away. And slowly, the petition for the good of the person and the good of the office comes in. And slowly, I'm asking the question, so what is my role in this? And slowly, I'm starting saying, well, can I then live in that place and drive that car and wear this shirt? It's a slow process, but it has to begin in the recognition that Christians do not act the way we do so that society may change. That we act and behave the way we do because of who we are, regardless of the other social pressures that force us to make choices. If you end up with two bad choices, there's always a third one. I don't have to accept the two choices. I have to look for the third one. And the third one may be none of the above.
Good stuff. So essentially, we maintain faithfulness and trust God for effectiveness.
Yeah. We're not called by God. Nowhere in Scripture are we called to change society. What we're called to is to let the Holy Spirit change us. That's the end. That's the beginning. That's the end. That's it. That's the game.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you giving up an hour of your valuable time, especially this time of year. It meant a lot and it helped me, and I know it'll help other people too.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, honor to be with you.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.